Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Man and Machine webinar. This is part 3 of the 10-part series of our Fusion 360 training, and I'm Chris England. I'm going to be your host. I hope everyone's staying safe and well during this hard time. So we're going to jump right into it. Last week, Frankie covered solid modeling using Fusion 360, and he used the normal CAD technique of creating solid bodies, and we created this hinge last week. So this week we're going to look into some additional component design options within Fusion 360. The first of which I want to cover is the sheet metal design. So within sheet metal design, and I'm just jumping over to a new part here or a new component. And the first thing to remember with sheet metal design is our sheet metal rules. So we click on sheet metal rules and the sheet metal rules window pops up. Starting off, we look and we see in our library we have a bunch of default rules. Now we can take any one of these depending on what material we want to use and what thickness we want to work in, and we can go and say new rule. We can give that new rule a name. I'm going to say 1.2 millimeter steel, and I'm going to give it a thickness. So I'm going to match the 1.2 millimeters that I've put into my name. And we see that there's a K factor here. So the K factor is obviously when we work with sheet metal, we have a stretch factor for when we unfold our sheet metal components. So we can edit that. Normally the default is fine. And if you're new to using sheet metal, start with the default and see how it works out on your machines. I'm going to hit save and we'll see my new sheet metal rule appear in the library. If I close that window and I go and create a new component, I can then go and choose empty component, and you'll see that I then have, because I've selected new component from the sheet metal option, I have options to choose which sheet metal rule I want to use. Now, from last week when we worked with creating the hinge, we created solid bodies and we created new bodies within the same component. Today, we're creating a new component, which in essence is its own part at the end of the day. So I'm going to give this component a name, and I'm going to call it my PLC housing. And I'm going to click OK. We'll see a new sheet metal part appear, or new sheet metal component rather, appear on the left. And if I then go and look underneath it, we can see that it has its own origin and the rule is over there. If I go and start by creating a sketch, I'm going to start on my XY plane. And I can start by creating a rectangle. I just want to make sure my orientation is correct. So I'll look at it from the side. And I'm going to start by creating my rectangle in place. So I'm going to make it 1200 by 500. And just using simple geometry, I'm going to use my midpoint to snap it to my center origin point and finish sketch. So with sheet metal design and in the sheet metal design environment, we don't use all the same tools that we saw last week in the solid modeling. For the most part, we use a tool called flange. Now, if you're an Inventor user, you would know that we have multiple tools like face and flange and various other sheet metal creation tools, and then the flange normally is just made for bends. In Fusion, however, our flange can be used to create a face too. So when I select in the profile, we can see that it applies the sheet metal thickness to that. And I don't really have too many options other than which side I want that thickness to go to. So I can either go down, side one, side two, or symmetric, which will go evenly about the sketch plane. I can see my operations on new body, and I click OK. So I have my first part of my sheet metal component. Now using the flange tool again, I can then go and select on edges, and we can see how I can then go and create bends within my sheet metal component. So I'm going to go ahead and create my first bend here, and I'm going to make it 1700. And we can see once again we do have more options here, so we can choose our angle if it's not going to be a 90-degree angle, and we can choose our datums, which is where our distance is measured from, either the outer face or from the bend radius, and there's various other options there. We have our bend position, which is the measurement of where our bend will sit from this edge, measuring from the front edge to the back of our bend. I want it to be inside because the 500 that I set my first panel to is the whole extent of my PLC case. And I'm going to go and say, OK. Now with that created, I can go and add in the rest of my box. So I'm going to go and use my flange tool again, and I'm going to select the edges. Now, depending on which edge you select, if I zoom in here, if I select this edge, by default, it's going to come towards me. If I select the outer edge, it's going to go by default away from me, but I can flip. Just remember, if you're doing edges that go in different directions and you try flip, they will go converse to each other. So I'm going to give that a distance of 500 to match the rest of the box. And we can see that the box starts to take shape. Now, looking at my edges, we can see that there's gaps left already based on the sheet metal norm. So when we create in sheet metal, we normally will fold and then we'll create a fillet weld or something of the sort there. So that's all contained within our rule. The benefit of using the sheet metal environment, because we can model the similar component or a similar component in normal solid modeling, is that we have the option to go and create a flat pattern from this. So if I choose flat pattern and I choose my stationary face, which is the face that's going to unfold from, and click OK, we can see that it unfolds the entire flat pattern sheet, and I can now view the profile of the sheet before it's folded. This is useful for then going on to our laser cutting or to sending it to the machine environment. And as such, we can actually export to a DXF, which is quite a common format for sending to machines. So if I wanted to export to a DXF, I just need to click OK, and it'll give me an option to save. So leaving the flat pattern brings me back to my folded model, and I can go and add in various other sheet metal components. Now, if I wanted to create my doors for my sheet metal box, they should be extra components. I could create them as solid bodies and make them into components later on, but I'll do this up front and create new components straight away. So using my same sheet metal rule, although if you do want various components with different sheet metal thicknesses, we can use different thicknesses here, or select a different one from my library. I'm going to say left door. Okay, and I'll click OK. And I'm going to start my first sketch on that same work plane. Now I can use my project geometry tool to project any edges I want to use. So, okay. And I can start sketching. Now I'm going to go to the halfway point, and I want my depth to be just, oops, sorry, that will be half of my width, which was 1,200, so we'll make that 600, and we'll go 50 over there. So I have my sketch, and I'm going to start the same process again. So I'm going to start with the flange, select my profile, and say OK. I can now continue with my flange command, make sure I'm getting the right edge, and go up by my same height. Oh, we were on 1.7, so same height, and we'll say OK. We'll then use the flange command to finish off the component, and I'll just flip over here, and we'll make them all 50 to match the rest. So we can see the first half of our door taking shape. Now, because I've done it in its own component, I can still go and make a flat pattern of this panel as well if I want to see the flat pattern. So it's also useful for our manufacturing techniques. And the difference there would be if we had made it a separate component, we would have ended up with two bodies, or if we had made it in the same component rather, we would have ended up with two solid bodies. And once you have two solid bodies within a sheet metal component, you cannot make a flat pattern within that one component anymore. You have to break them up into two components, which is why it's always better to make two components. Right, so going back to my top level, right clicking and activating, we can see that my box is now starting to take shape. I'll leave it for here for now because we're going to use the same door panel on both sides. We'll just mirror it, but we'll look at that in next week's session on the adding components together and making an assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and save that into my cloud folder, and I'm going to call it PLC case. And we're going to look at some other techniques of modeling within Fusion 360. So I want to create a handle for my PLC case, and often when we're creating items that have those complex geometry or complex shapes, so I've gone and sketched out quite a simple sketch, but using splines, so curvature, advanced curvature, and using such geometry can often be very tricky to model. So when we look at something like this, and I've just drawn in a general shape here of what I want my door handle to look like. It's probably a bit fancy for a PLC case, but it will serve the purpose for showing the modeling techniques that I would like to show. So when looking at something like this, and I'm going to use this sketch as a general guideline now, because what I'm going to use is a tool called Freeform modeling. So I'm going to use this tool over here within our solid command or solid tab, and I'm going to say create form. Now it brings me into the Freeform modeling toolbar, so you can see it's its own tab at the top for form, and I have a bunch of geometric shapes that I can start to create my model with. I'm going to start with using just a simple box, and I'm going to place it on my YZ plane. Now, when we create a box, or any of the geometric shapes, I suppose the solid shapes, some of them are surface shapes, which I'll discuss in just a second, we place from the center. So I'm going to try and get the rough center of this sketch that I have here and just drag it out to roughly the size I want it. So that'll do fine. And we can see my form then takes shape. So it's just a simple square at this stage. I'm going to change my height, which should be this distance here, and I'm going to make it 15. And I'm going to use my width, make it 15 as well. Right, so that's fine. So we just want a general shape here. We're not going for any sort of accuracy. We're going to do that within the modeling. Now you can see that I have faces. So I've got length faces, I've got width faces, and I've got height faces. So if I change my height faces, for example, and I made it 20, you can see that it adds additional. Oh, sorry, that was my height. Let's try my length faces here and say 15, for example. You can see that we get more blocks or less squares within our, or I suppose they're rectangles, within our freeform geometry. So looking at that, I'm going to leave it on 50 or on 10 here, and I'm going to say OK. Now, the trick with freeform modeling is to shape it. So I like to think of it much like clay. We work with a piece of geometry, and we just push and pull the geometry into the shape that we want it to be. So I'm going to start with the symmetry plane or symmetry line within my model, and I'm going to just select the two halves or two faces that represent that symmetry line. And you can see that the line then draws itself right around the geometry. So that green line is now my symbol of symmetry. So anything that happens on one side, if I'm looking at it here, my left side and my right side will act equally and the same. So we're going to start shaping this into place. So we use a tool called the modify tool, the edit form from the modify dropdown, the edit form tool, and you'll see when I pull it up, I get my edit form menu. Now we have a lot of filters here. I like to use it with the general transform mode, but we can isolate certain controls within this menu. So if I said translation, so if I just selected face, for example, you can see that I get my full triad with all of the transform modes and all of the options involved. If I go and say just translation, you can see that it just gives me my translation arrows, or just rotation gives me my rotation nodes, and scale gives me my scale nodes. Leaving it on the first option, the multi, gives us all of those options in one. I like to work with that because it's easier to jump through, but if you find that you're grabbing on the wrong things, make sure you use the filters. The other options we have here are selection filters, so we can see that once again I'm on all, but our selection options are to either select a vertex, an edge, or a face. And when we do so, it has varying effects on the model. So for example, I'm on a face now. If I start to push down on my transform, we can see that it then how it affects. If I want to select more than one face, I can hold Control on my keyboard and do the same thing. So I want to bring this face down alone. And as soon as I click away from that face, my edit is then held into place. So you can see how when we push and pull our geometry, we can start to get the formation we're looking for. So I want all of these to come down. So I'm just going to hold down Control and select them all. I've got an edge there. Select all the faces, bring them all down. Now it's good to use perspective here. So I'm going to click on my right view. So look it straight on. So I can try and match the rough shape of my sketch. Okay, we can see that it needs to come down here. So I'm going to use my edge and pull it down. So it's very much a touch and feel sort of environment or method of modeling. Apart from our general first shape and geometry that we enter, we don't have many options to use actual dimensioning. So you can see that I can translate by certain dimensions, but after that there's no parametric sort of editing other than going and pushing and pulling once again. If I want to go in two directions at once, I can actually grab on the plane node and start to shape it in two directions. Do the same for this face here. Pull it in a bit, and I actually want that edge to come down a bit more too. So we can see how by just pushing and pulling, we can start to get the shape that we're looking for. We'll do some more work down here. So I'm going to select first this plane, pulling it down. Other planes will stretch if need be to try and accommodate, but sometimes you've got to use a bit of initiative and use edges or vertexes to try and get the shape that you're looking for. So that's not looking too bad now. I just wanted to mention one or two extra things. If you do have a basic shape and you find that you need more faces, we can use the face select and hold down Alt on our keyboards to pull up, and you'll see that it actually adds in a new face. And each time I do that, I end up with new faces. Now, I don't actually want that. I just wanted to show you the tool. So I'm just going to hit Control Z for undo. Now, with this shape roughly the way I want it, obviously the door handle is going to face us. And we might want more shape on the one side than on the other, on the reverse side, where it's just going to be our fingers grabbing around the handle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my symmetry line by clicking the symmetry drop down and saying clear symmetry, choose my body and say OK, and my symmetry line falls away. Now I might want to put a little bit of extra shaping on the front because that's obviously the aesthetic facing side. So I'm going to go and modify again, choose a couple of my edges and move them down a bit to get a bit of a sync. And now what we'll see here is that that's now not affecting both sides of my model because my symmetry line is now removed. So if I go ahead and carry on shaping it, one thing you do want to make sure that you don't do in this environment is have any self-intersecting geometry. So for example, if I pull this line right the way through, you can see eventually it's going to self-intersect, and that's a big no-no in the freeform environment. So if I do that, my shape's going to fail and I'm not going to be able to get solid geometry out of this model at the end of the day. Benefits of it, of using this environment, is that we can do that. We can obviously use some advanced manufacturing techniques these days, and by doing this, we can actually 3D print it. We can go straight to the 3D printing environment, which we'll be looking at later on in the YouTube sessions. We can do various manufacturing techniques like CAM, and obviously creating it is a lot easier these days than it was possibly in the past. So using the freeform modeling environment is great for using creating any sort of shapes that you'd want to be more aesthetically pleasing, um, to look a bit more like an advanced curvature rather than using your traditional solid modeling where we can use basic geometry and cut and join. So my handle is roughly where I want it to be. So I'm going to leave the freeform environment and have a look. I can still see my sketch, so I'm going to turn off my original sketch, and we can see how geometry now looks. You can see it's got a nice unique shape to it, and that's the advantage of the freeform environment, is that we can just push and pull our model and move it into place the way we want to see it. I'm going to add in a little notch on here, so I can still combine. Once I've got my freeform and I've left my form environment, I can still combine other modeling techniques. So I can still use my solid modeling, for example, and I'm going to create a sketch on my YZ plane. I'm going to go and create a circle. I'm going to make it 8. Oh, 8's probably a bit big. Let's go a bit smaller. Let's edit that dimension. So put it down and edit our dimension, and let's make that 5. And we're going to just then use our dimensions. I'm pushing D on my keyboard to get to dimensions, in case you're wondering how I was getting there earlier. And I'm going to make that 35. And I'm going to then space it from my origin. It's always good to fully constrain your sketches to make sure that they're in place. So should we move it parametrically, we know that the model won't react in a way that we don't foresee. So hitting finish sketch, I can go and extrude and pull it out a bit. I'm going to make that my operation. So you can see by the red that I've got a cut operation. I want it to be a join operation, and I want it to be negative 15. See, select that negative 15, and we can see that I've added it, and it's now the same part of the same body. So this is now my handle for later use. We can edit it later on to make it a bit more conducive to a PLC case, but any sort of aesthetic model can be made with this freeform tool. And remember, you can combine your solid modeling techniques. Now, just a few other little things to mention within the Fusion environment is that we obviously have the surface command, which I'm not going to be able to show you today as we don't have enough time, but we can also use surface modeling when it comes to more aesthetic sort of jobs. So creating a surface, and I'll just show you a few of the tools. If we go into a new component and we create a sketch, for example, the trick with surfacing, so we looked at solid modeling, and obviously to create a solid model, we needed to have a closed piece of geometry to create the solid body. With surface modeling, we can create individual or open sketches and individual pieces of geometry that can then be used. So if I was going to create something a little more curved, I can use a spline, and I'm just going to use my curvature rule to match those up. So if I had a shape like that and I wanted to then go and create that as maybe one wall of a part or something like that, I can use my extrude here, and I can actually extrude it. Now the catch with surface modeling is that there's zero thickness. So it's not like the sheet metal environment I showed you first up, where we have a governed thickness, except now that we don't work with a thickness. And we have two goals here, to either create a surface body to then be thickened into a solid body. Our end goal is often and normally to create a solid body at the end of the day, but we use our surfaces to then get some sort of complex shape, and we can use our thicken tool to go and create that into a shape. So we can use thicken, and we just select the body, and we then give it a thickness. And we can see that it then becomes a solid. The other option is to completely enclose a body, and then we can use something like the stitch tool to go and create that into a full solid. So having a look at that, we now have a solid body. So if I go look at my bodies, we can see that we have both a surface, which is my original, and my solid body. That solid body can now be used to create a component and do any of the various things. So just a quick recap as we jumped around through a few different environments. We looked at the sheet metal environment. Remember the important thing being to look into your sheet metal rules to start off with. We looked at the freeform environment, which is a simple matter of having some sort of basic shape. You don't have to have a sketch. As you saw, I didn't use the sketch to start off with. I just used it as a guideline because that was the basic shape of the handle I wanted to use. But we can use various different sketches. We can also use images, so we can insert an image. So if you want to, recreate something that you've seen, like this example here in the image here, that we have a car or something like that, you can use your different planes of the car and attach images to those planes and model against the image. Obviously, try your best to scale it to the right size before starting. And the key here was to just create a form, any shape or size of the geometry that's sort of close enough, and we then just use our edit form tool to push and pull our geometry into the form that we want or the shape that we want. And lastly, although briefly mentioned, you have the surface modeling option, which allows you to create surfaces which have a zero thickness, but we can then either go and use the thicken tool to create a solid body out of them, or use our stitch tool to go and encapsulate them and make a solid out of the full enclosure. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope it's been informative and I hope it's been useful to you. Thank you very much.